for your packet is to understand for topic 1, we're looking at this idea of suffrage. And if you don't remember, I wrote suffrage on the slide. Suffrage is the right to vote. So how are people getting the right to vote? What groups were not allowed the right to vote? So when you originally look at the Constitution, or even before the United States was created, when we were just the 13 colonies, depending on the colony you lived in was depending on if you had the right to vote or not. So a general rule would be white male landowners. So if you're 13 years old and you're owning land, you're voting. If you're an 87-year-old man, kudos to making it to 87 in the 1600s, who doesn't own land, you are not allowed to vote. Now, obviously that's changed a lot since our country's founding, and we're continuing to move. So here's how this is going to work. When we look at the Reconstruction Amendments, that is Amendment 13, 14, and 15. Those are the 3 amendments that come directly out of the Civil War. So these are the amendments that, because we have the Civil War, we get these 3 amendments. Now, if you are remembering the Civil War more, you know that the Civil War was fought over states' rights and slavery, okay? So we're going to focus on the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote, not women, okay? Now, this is considered to be the first voting rights act that the government made since the Constitution was created in 1789, okay? So this is supposed to be the first step in voting rights equality. Now we're going to forget about women for a second, like our founding fathers did, because apparently women weren't as important back then. You know that's not my real belief, but we're going to go with it. Now, the original thought of the people who passed the 15th Amendment, the ones that really wanted to give former slaves the right to vote. Okay, this is their thought process. We passed the 15th Amendment. Everyone is going to have the right to vote who is a former slave that's a man. We're not going to have to struggle with this at all. Is that really how it happened? No, that's not how it happened. We talked a little bit in the beginning of the year about poll taxes and literacy tests. Poll taxes, they would make you pay to vote. I just want to be clear on this. You do not have to pay to vote, okay? Voting is a right given to you. All you have to do is be a citizen and you get to vote. You do not have to pay for it, okay? So back then they were targeting African Americans and former slaves, and they were saying, okay, we're going to charge you $5. Now I know that doesn't seem like a lot in 2020, but in 1870 that was a lot of money, especially for former slaves who had never been paid money before in their entire lives. So the idea was, because former slaves and African Americans were economically disadvantaged, they were more than likely to make less money than anyone else. Putting this tax out there was going to cause such a burden for them that they would not vote because they couldn't afford it. Now, were there African Americans and former slaves who could afford to vote? Absolutely. Did they let them vote? Well, not only did you have to pass a poll tax, but you had to pass a literacy test. And literacy tests are gauged to see if you can or cannot read. Now, if you remember, before COVID ruined our lives and our school fun, I would put bell ringers up on the board for you. And one day I put these questions like, what does Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution say? They were really tough questions, and you were all looking at me like, we never talked about this. Well, those were questions from a literacy test. So literacy tests weren't really given to test and see if they could read. They were just trying to stop former slaves and African Americans from voting. So as more people passed these literacy tests, the harder they made them. That's their goal. Now, you can use this information. If you look at your assignment, I have a thing that says, this is the last assignment for this packet, okay? Those are our 3 goals for this unit, the 3 things that I really want you to know and understand. So use this information to answer that first question, okay? Now on to women, women's suffrage, because we all know that women are strong and independent and equal to men, okay? This is a fact. All right, so we've got women's suffrage, and here's kind of the race to women's suffrage. We are looking at a woman. Her name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Now, during this time period in the 1840s, they were experiencing something, it's a time period called progressivism. Now, if you can remember from your American history class, I know we talked about it. I don't know what you Kettler kids talked about. I know you like him a lot. I'm just kidding. I know he talked about this too. So, Mr. Kettler and I in our American history classes talked a lot about the progressive era. And the progressive era is just the idea that we want to make society a better place for ourselves, for our children, and for future generations. So the two things that were a really big push were anti-slavery, because in the 1840s, this is before the Civil War, and women's right to vote. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is considered to be the woman that gave women the right to vote, her and her friend Lucretia asked to go to a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, I'm sorry. So they are from the US, they travel across the ocean on a boat, and they are so excited. They've got so many ideas on how to push forth anti-slavery movements, how to end slavery. They're so excited, but here's what happens to them. When they show up, they're greeted at the door by a man, and he says, "You're women, what are you doing here?" They say, "Well, we have ideas. We were invited. We want to contribute." So they told these two women that had traveled across an ocean that they weren't intelligent enough to sit in this convention and have an actual conversation with other men. They said that to their faces. "You're not intelligent enough." They'd never met them before. This is what they said. So they were forced to sit in another room with the door open so they could hear what was being discussed, but they put a curtain so that the men could not see the women, because back then they believed that if men saw women, they would lose all of their intelligence apparently and not be able to have a coherent conversation. So these women are pretty upset that they traveled across an ocean to participate in this, discussion about anti-slavery. This is what they wanted to do. So here's what they decided to do. In 1848, they hold the Seneca Falls Convention. If you don't know, Seneca Falls is in New York State, and this is the first ever women's rights convention. And what they do is they take a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and this famous line in the Declaration of Independence says, "All men are created equal." Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton added, "All men and women are created equal." And this is their moment where they're talking about women are going to get the right to vote, and this is why. Now, in the assignment that I gave you, what you're going to do is you're reading primary sources, so what they actually talked about, and then you're answering questions. So when we look at anti-suffrage sections in that assignment, anti-suffrage is anti-voting. So not anti-voting in general, but anti-women getting the right to vote. There were other women who said women shouldn't get the right to vote. There were men who said women shouldn't get the right to vote, and the government in general didn't want women to have the right to vote. They would say things like, women can't serve in the government and they can't vote because they're not allowed to be in the military. And if they've never been in the military, how can they make military decisions? I would just like to insert here that there have been women in American history since the first battle that have wanted to participate in war and had to dress up as men to participate. There was a woman in the Civil War who did this. Several women in the American Revolution did this. So this is not women didn't want to be in the military. This is women were not allowed because they were women. There were also men who would say, well, what if a man and his wife have different political beliefs? They won't get along, so obviously the women shouldn't be allowed to express their political beliefs. These are real things that people said. It's unfortunate that I can't see your faces because I can't tell if you're like, oh wow, people were terrible back then, or if you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Listen, you do not have to have the same political beliefs as anyone else. You just have to be able to have a conversation and be respectful of different opinions, okay? There is a famous quote by a founding father, and he says, "I do not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it." Okay, those are the two differences there. And then just a little bit of more information. If you're interested in these topics, especially women's rights, there are two movies that I typically show you movie clips from. However, I can't do that. Iron Jawed Angels is an amazing movie about women getting the right to vote, and actually goes through women being, women who were protesting, they were being force fed when they were arrested. Fantastic. And then another movie called On the Basis of Sex. This is about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a Supreme Court justice now in 2020. But before she was a Supreme Court justice, she became responsible for women gaining majority of their rights in the 1960s. So two really great movies that I would recommend. I have to say this, ask your parents' permission. If you don't, that's up to you, but it's on record that I've said it. Okay? If you have any questions about what we've talked about, you can email me. I left you my Google phone number on the packet, so go ahead and reach out to me. One thing, if you want to talk to me, especially if you're going to be texting me, tell me who you are, because I cannot read minds and I will not know, oh, this is Muhammad, he sent me a text message. I have no idea, okay? So tell me who you are. Even if you have no questions and you just want to reach out and say hi, you can say hi. I'm going to end this video and then I'm going to do another one on the next two topics. Bye, everyone.